sensuality, intimacy, power, and agency. What do all these terms have in common? I'm S.J. Lyon, and this is the Sex Talk. The aforementioned terms may seem unrelated, but they come together in a major way to define our topic for today. If I were to ask you to define sexuality for me, you'd probably give me a definition more akin to sexual orientation. You might not even have any idea of how to define sexuality. That's all right. Sexuality is complicated and made up of many different parts. We often like to think of sexuality as something that just appears one day when we reach a certain age. But sexuality isn't just about your genitals or having sex. Sexuality is with us our entire life and changes as we move through life. Dr. Dennis M. Daly does an excellent job in defining, explaining, and illustrating the major facets of sexuality and how they overlap in a model he designed. This model is known as the circles of sexuality. You may be familiar with Venn diagrams. You know, the 2 or 3 circles that often overlap in the middle. You would usually use them to compare and contrast things. The circles of sexuality model is very similar, but with a lot more circles. Here, take a look for yourself. Note the different terms in each circle. Let's start with sensuality. Sensuality is defined simply as the physical senses, both our awareness and experience of them. Intimacy, on the other hand, is the ability and desire for closeness with other people. Therefore, it requires the participation of another person, unlike sensuality. Not everyone who has sex experiences intimacy, or even wants to. Someone may have sex solely for the physical pleasure of it, and not care about the intimacy. And still others may have sex for both the physical pleasure and the intimacy of it. Gender identity relates to a person's feelings, sense, or understanding of who they are in relation to their gender. Sexual orientation is the way or ways in which an individual experiences or wants to experience sexual desires and feelings. I believe these two are lumped together because they're simply too hard to separate like some of the other ones. An individual may change how they define their sexual orientation depending on their gender identity. A transgender individual, for instance, may define their sexual orientation as gay or lesbian before realizing that they are transgender. They may switch back to being straight once they realize that they are transgender. This is common and completely valid. Sexual and reproductive health is yet another component of the overall picture of sexuality. It has to do with our capacity or ability, or lack thereof, to reproduce. It also involves our feelings about reproducing as well as our experiences with reproducing. There are plenty of people in the world who don't want children, but still have sex. There are plenty of other people in the world who believe sex should only be had for the purposes of reproducing. These two vastly different views lead us to our next concept, sexual behaviors and practices. This circle obviously involves what we or others actively do sexually. If you fall into the first camp of individuals, your sex practices probably look much different than the individuals who fall into the second camp. Our final circle is that of power and agency. You may have noticed that this circle sits front and center of all the rest. The author of my source material believes that power and agency play a huge role in all aspects of sexuality. I'm inclined to agree with this, as an individual lacking power and agency has very little control over their sexuality. Power is defined for our purposes as the ability or capacity to do something. This can involve having the strength, force, capacity, or ability to exercise control over ourselves or others. Agency deals with what a person has the right, ability, or power to do. An individual's level of power and agency can vary greatly from situation to situation. You may, for instance, have a different level of power and agency at school versus home, depending on what those atmospheres are like. If you're gay and live in a very homophobic atmosphere, your power and agency is going to look a lot different than someone else who is gay but lives in a non-homophobic atmosphere. As I stated at the beginning, sensuality is complicated. Writing out a clear-cut definition isn't easy, but that's okay. It's hard to explain and pinpoint because it varies so greatly between people. Your sexuality isn't going to look like mine, or your friends, or even your partner's. That's the beauty of this model. The circles may be arranged differently depending on who you are. There may be circles that play a larger role for you than for others. Your sexuality is a part of you, so why not explore it? I'm S.J. Lyon. This has been the Sex Talk on sexuality. And until next time, stay safe, everyone.